So our place is obviously, geographically speaking, most of us taking this course would be located in the place we call Alaska. And just speaking in terms of the population state of the state, the vast majority of the people taking this class also are probably located either in Anchorage or in the Matsu area or on the Kenai Peninsula, which is where I'm located since I teach down here in Soldotna. And in that case, for the vast majority of us, we are living in Dena'ina land, as the title of this lecture says, right? The Dena'ina word spoken there, Dena'ia Elena Aheshnu U Yeshtu. What that means is I live and work in the land of the Dena'ina. The Kenai Peninsula is actually a bit more complex. There are both Alutiiq areas and Dena'ina areas on the Kenai Peninsula. But again, for the vast majority of people that are taking this class, we live on Dena'ina land. And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge and to be aware of. This is a map that kind of reinforces what I'm talking about here. So again, Dena'ina, which is an Athabascan group, traditionally the territory of the Dena'ina include many different villages and communities in this broad swath of Alaska. Nearby to that, by the way, is Atna, and there are actually, as the reading talks about, I believe, Atna connections to and names with Anchorage as well. And so that's important and also helps kind of explain one of the reasons why here at Kenai Peninsula College we actually have classes in both Dena'ina and Atna, among others. So our place for many of us is Dena'ina land. That's part of what I mean by acknowledging our land. At the same time, knowing our place is not just knowing our geographic place, but it's also knowing our historic place, our place in history. What I mean by that is, although Alaska is a relatively new state, as a place where people have lived, it is many millennia old. And Dena'ina people, specifically within Anchorage Peninsula, this Cook Inlet region, as far as archaeologists are concerned, have lived here from around 500 to 1,000, and so many years. And in fact, here is a cool kind of visual of that, so let's open it up. So this was put together by the Anchorage Museum, or at least it's through the Anchorage Museum, I should say, and it's sort of a timeline of Dena'ina history. Sorry, that took forever to go. But as you can see, there are millennia of sort of history of Alaska Native people living in this region, and then specifically archaeological remains seem to suggest that Dena'ina people were here in the Cook Inlet region at least by AD 500 to 1000, that kind of range. So it's a very long time, and it's an important part of the history of this place we occupy. At the same time, the history, of course, goes much further than that and includes Russian moving into an occupation of the area in the mid to late 1700s, as well as the violence that often accompanied that. It includes the smallpox epidemic and the very devastating effect this had on Dena'ina people. It included culture change and different influences. It includes how the place we call Alaska eventually came into the possession of the United States and how it eventually became a state, and even eventually how statehood, and eventually how you had a very important law called ANTH, which set up what we think of as the Alaska Native Corporations and established a lot of different rules about how Alaska Native governance and sovereignty works in Alaska. And so all of that history has informed our present, right? All of it affects things. If you're wondering why are Alaska Native groups often organized as corporations here versus other kinds of entities in the lower 48, if you're wondering about why there aren't very many reservations in Alaska, in fact really only one in the truest sense of the word, but there are Alaska Native villages, if you're wondering about why in some areas Alaska Native groups might have a lot of power and in other areas almost no power to determine their fate or to determine what happens on land that's meaningful to them, all of that, there's a history to that, and there's a history to why there are both Alaska Native people and non-Native people and settler people here in Alaska. And so part of knowing our place is knowing those histories. And I think when we do so, the goal, especially when we talk about colonialism and the drastic effects this had, and the ways in which, for example, as I talked about in the reading, the way in which Dena'ina fishing camps and Dena'ina villages all over sort of the Cook Inlet region, including in Anchorage, were really pushed out, right, by the settlement of Anchorage, and by sort of the boom in population in Alaska in the mid-20th and late 20th century. And when we talk about that, the goal is not to induce guilt if you happen to be from a non-native background. I don't think that's my point as a teacher or an educator, is to make you feel guilty for historical events. That's, I don't think, very useful or productive. The point here is also not to tell you to have a certain kind of politics or policy I'm a very big proponent of. You probably come in with all sorts of different beliefs and policy views, and that's great and that's fine, and that's not my job to change yours. The point is just that whatever our viewpoints on the contemporary state of Alaska, it should be rooted in an awareness, right? An awareness of the history of Alaska, an awareness of how that's affected the present day situation for Native Alaska groups. And I think that's where we go from sort of a land acknowledgement. So you'll hear people a lot of times say, well, land acknowledgement. So at the start of a meeting, we're going to acknowledge that this is Dena'ina land. I think that's a good first step, right? It's good for us to understand sort of the original lands that we occupy. But at the same time, I think we need to move from a land acknowledgement, not just that, but to a land relationship, meaning that we take the time to truly learn not just about whose land this originally was and kind of say it as a one-off, but to really live that and try to learn about the native cultures of the land, not just historically, but also present day. What's going on with Native Alaska groups today? What are the different challenges they might face? What are the different opportunities they might face? How does their culture persist? How do their cultures persist? And so that's all sort of aspects of what this course is going to be about.